This is PowerPoint 1.3 on organized labor, more specifically on the development of organized labor in the latter part of the 19th century. What we want to keep in mind with this is that the organization of labor unions in the later 19th century follows essentially along two paths. And this will actually carry us into the 20th century as well. The first is the growth of labor movements is a reaction to business, and it's more a reaction to the business cycles that will be experienced. Now, what we mean by that is during a growth cycle, okay, the business cycle has four stages: the growth cycle, the peak, the recession, the trough, and then growth goes again. Okay, and so we have these four stages. During a growth period, the demand for labor is rising because business is growing, production is increasing, and so the demand for labor goes up. As it reaches the peak, the demand for labor is equal to the supply for labor. Then as it goes into a recession, production drops, the demand for labor drops, the supply of labor exceeds the demand for labor, and then it hits the trough where you have the highest supply of labor, the least demand for labor. Now, during these periods when the demand for labor is less than the supply of labor, what you experience is lower wages, poorer working conditions, because you have a large supply of labor, a small demand for labor. So it's in essence a buyer's market for labor. Okay, during growth cycles and during the peak, this is a little bit different. There, it's a seller's market for labor. Okay. Because you have growth, the demand for labor eventually outstrips the supply of labor, and so what we see is we see wage increases, we see better working conditions, etc. Now that's the one path that it follows. The other path that it's going to follow is based on the political milieu of the time, the political environment of the time. And so in the latter 19th century, all the way up through the 1890s, the development of labor unions is characterized is by extreme drama, I guess I would call it, where you have strikes that become very violent. You have the Haymarket Massacre in 1886. You have a series of things. This is what we're famous. This is the famous time of the Pinkertons and the breaking of the steel strikes, etc. In the early 20th century, that's going to change, and it's largely going to change because the progressive movement, which is at least partially an offshoot of this, will develop, okay, in the 1890s and really in the early 20th century. And as a result of that, the progressive movement has a lot of elements that are very pro-labor, which is why they'll ultimately be referred to as a kind of a socialist movement, and there were some elements of that. Okay. We see here the famous formation of the labor unions, the earliest of which was the National Labor Union. Then you have the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor will eventually go under the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, which still exists. The American Railway Union. This was Eugene Debs, founded in 1892. Eugene Debs will later be the founder of the American Socialist Party, the Socialist Workers of America. Then we have the Industrial Workers of the World, known as the Wobblies. And now, a side note here on the Molly Maguires and the formation of the United Mine Workers. This was just before the United Mine Workers formed. They were the kind of the nascent formation of a labor union. And there's an absolutely fantastic movie about them. I looked for it on Netflix, and you can't get it on Netflix. Netflix largely you get just crap movies because they don't have rights to any of the good ones. But it's a tremendous movie. It stars Sean Connery and Richard Harris. And in fact, it's Sean Connery's first role after his James Bond years. So it's from the early 70s. And it tells the story of the Molly Maguires. The Molly Maguires were a group of Irish immigrant coal miners in Pennsylvania. It's set in Pennsylvania and West Virginia. It's actually set in Pennsylvania. And their development, their reaction to poor working conditions, poor wages, etc. And they develop effectively a vigilante organization that commits acts of sabotage and violence against the mine owners in an attempt to gain leverage to argue for better conditions. And in the movie, Richard Harris plays a Pinkerton agent that infiltrates the organization, and it's actually based on a true story. So if you have a chance, catch it, because it really characterizes more than that, the experience of labor movement formation in the latter 19th century. The first of the major strikes is this great upheaval. This is the famous B&O Railroad strike of 1877. It starts in Martinsburg, West Virginia, and you can see what the synopsis of basically what it was. This was during a time of rapid business growth and, more significantly, rapid immigration. One of the things that we're going to use as the backdrop throughout this PowerPoint is the idea that when the supply of labor goes up and the demand for labor does not go up to meet it, you are going to have supply greater than demand. Therefore, you'll have a surplus in labor. Therefore, the wages of labor will go down. The working conditions of labor will go down, etc. This is what I said. It follows the business cycle. Well, this is the background of the B&O Railroad strike. We have massive influxes of immigrant populations, mostly from Eastern Europe, but also from Ireland and some others. This is the second wave of Irish immigration after the 1840s and 50s. So you have an abundant supply of labor at a time when the coal industry is starting to experience its first difficulties, because there's the massive growth of business hits a sluggish point and then will pick up again. But during that sluggish point, you have a massive supply of labor, a low demand for labor because there's a lower demand for coal. And so as a result, the B&O Railroad puts its workers, and that's the reason that I tied this in with coal is because largely the coal industry is what's using the B&O Railroad at this time, particularly in West Virginia. Okay, so as the coal industry starts to go down, suffers through a recession, the rail industry is going to suffer through the same recession, and so they're going to slash workers' pay. They do it twice in an 8-month period. The workers then walk out on strike. The governor calls out the National Guard, which is ineffective because the National Guard are the neighbors of the strikers, and so they largely join the strikers. The strike then spreads to Reading, Pennsylvania, to western Pennsylvania, and then out to eastern Pennsylvania and the Reading and Pennsylvania railroads. Public opinion is generally sympathetic for the workers. Okay, and finally, federal troops are called in to squash the strike and return the rail system, because the rail system is considered an integral part of national security. So the president at the time will call out the federal troops, and this will be the use of federal troops against the civilian population. Tactically speaking, and this goes to this day, the primary tactical instruments of unions to exercise leverage over employers is to threaten strikes or to walk out on strikes, to boycott the product, okay, to encourage people not to purchase the product, and to commit acts of sabotage. This is particularly when I was discussing the Molly Maguires before, this was their particular tactic. They weren't strong enough really to call a strike because the supply of labor was too great and they could just bring in other workers. They couldn't organize a boycott successfully, and so sabotage was their next alternative. Now, for the bosses, they had a host. Okay, it was definitely a lopsided contest, at least in the early days. That'll change in the early 20th century. It'll change again after the Second World War, particularly in the 1960s and 70s. But at this point, they have the courts who will make judgments against unions. They have the government, which, as we've just seen, will call out federal troops to crack down on the unions. Scabs refer to the surplus labor. The more surplus laborers there are, the more scabs are available. A scab is someone who walks across the picket line and does the job of the striking worker. Okay, this is particularly prevalent in unskilled labor, when laborers are basically just a dime a dozen. You can hire anybody off the street to serve as a laborer. Yellow dog contracts, which prohibit workers from joining a labor union. Lockouts, which is to say that they'll shut down their facilities so the workers won't have jobs and they won't get paid. And then finally, blacklists. This was very prevalent and is still prevalent, that union activists and union organizers are often blacklisted by employers and their names circulated among other employers. So they get fired from where they're organizing, and then nobody else will hire them because they have the reputation for being a union organizer. Okay, in this we have this is from Walton and Rockoff. This is the development of labor unions. You can see what I said. It fluctuates both with the political environment and with business cycles, and pay particular attention to the period from 1890 to 1900 where labor union formation is somewhat sluggish, and from 1886 to 1890. This is a result, one, of the heavy-handed method of crushing labor unions, which worked as a deterrent to form labor unions, and because the economy will enter into a period of economic downturn, ultimately with the U.S. economy melting down in 1893. The United States enters into a period of economic depression. As I've said before on previous PowerPoints, on previous lectures, that in 1893, the U.S. economy will essentially melt down because of the strain on the banking system. Well, when that happens, when it goes into a depression, as I said at the outset of this, the economy will go into a recession. As a result of the economy going into a recession, production will be down. As production drops, the demand for labor drops, and it doesn't take very long before the supply of labor exceeds the demand for labor, and once again, that means bad things for labor unions. The other setback that they're going to experience is the fact that labor unions are dealt with very harshly in the late 19th century, and by harshly what I mean is they're shot. Okay? We have many examples of union organizers being murdered. We have many examples of labor unions being cracked down by. The most famous of them was the Pinkerton Detective Agency, and they were essentially a mercenary force that would be bought by the union bosses, or by the not the union bosses, by the bosses to crush the union. And so we have many examples of that. And finally, union membership begins to drop again in the 1890s. One of the reasons for it is massive influxes of immigrants. This will also happen in the 1920s. I didn't mention that. That's one of the reasons for the downturn in labor organization in the 1920s, is because you have, after the First World War, a number of immigrants coming into the United States. Anytime the number of immigrants goes up, you increase the supply of labor, and when you increase the supply of labor and make it exceed the demand for labor, the value of labor goes down. It's like any other labor is like any other economic commodity. Okay? And so we really just want you, all I'm trying to do is get you to remember a basic economic principle. Nothing high-minded, nothing real technical. Okay? And we know this from any economics experience we might have. If supply is greater than demand, the price goes down. That's true of all commodities. That's true of labor. Okay? These are the major strikes of the late 19th century. We talked about the Great Upheaval. In all, nearly 100,000 workers participated in spontaneous strikes, mostly in Pennsylvania and West Virginia, but throughout the Northeast. And actually throughout the country, but mostly focused on the Northeast. You have the Great Hawking Coal Strike, the Railroad Strike. The Haymarket Massacre was a difficult one. This was towards the later 1880s, and you had a rising tide of sympathy for the labor movement, and a combination of labor union activists and labor union members combined with a group of anarchists in Chicago to have a demonstration, and it was a peaceable demonstration. The police were called in to clear the streets, and when the police arrived, someone threw a bomb into the midst of the police, killing 6 policemen and injuring about 60 more. The police responded by opening fire on the strikers, and so it was considered a massacre. Then you have the Homestead Strike. That's right here in Pittsburgh, the Homestead Steel Strike. This was the first real use of the Pinkertons in 1892. And in all, They killed about 200 workers. They shot about 200 workers. Then you have the Pullman strike, and this was President Cleveland's use of federal troops to crush the strike. Again, we have U.S. troops. These aren't National Guardsmen. These are full-time U.S. soldiers. This is the National Army being used to crush a civilian population. And so it always strikes me as unusual that the United States kind of looks down its nose at other countries who use the army to clear demonstrators from the street. Most recently, Thailand did it last year, as though to use the National Army against the civilian population is the telltale signs of a military dictatorship, and that the United States has done it on several occasions. We'll see additional occasions that it uses it. Of course, there's the famous Kent State shooting, which was the National Guard, and then there's also in the 1930s when the Veterans March on Washington, demanding their bonus pay, which is referred to as bonus army. And of course, we'll get to that when we get to the 1930s. Douglas MacArthur will lead the army against them. Now, here's the general trend that is established by these strikes. First, when the strikers go out, you hire non-union laborers, scabs, to cross the picket line. You use the Pinkertons to break the strike physically through intimidation and violence. And finally, you will have the availability of federal troops. You also will have the court systems that will back it. Ultimately, we'll get to this when we get to the 1890s and the monetary conditions and the political developments. You have the passage of the Sherman Antitrust Act, which we'll get to again in a later lecture, is originally intended not to stop business trusts from forming or the conglomeration of businesses. It's designed originally to stop the formation of labor unions, because it's determined that a labor union, we talked in the last presentation about the development of corporate conglomerates, principally horizontal mergers where the producers produce the same final product and merge together. Okay, and the results of this are price fixing, etc., etc. Okay, well, it's determined that labor unions represent the same thing. You have workers, all of whom produce the same product, namely labor. Even specifically, if we deal with steel, they're steel workers. Okay, they then organize together, conglomerate, and then engage in price fixing. Okay, by unionizing. And so, however, there's a general trend. Despite the reversals for labor in the later 19th century, there's a general trend towards higher wages, lower hours, and improved working conditions. And so despite the setbacks that labor experiences in the late 19th century, which are significant, they do actually make incremental gains from really 1860 through the 1900s. And then in the early 20th century, of course, as I've said before, they're going to make precipitous gains until they get to 1920s. Now, immigration and labor unions, as I've said before, this is just the same point, the same principle that I'm stressing over and over. Okay? As more immigration takes place, your supply of labor goes up, particularly your supply of unskilled labor. This then exceeds the demand for labor. That has a tendency to serve as a downward pressure on the price of labor, which is to say the wage, a downward pressure on working conditions. And so, ultimately, I have down here the reference to the New York draft riots. For those of you who saw Leonardo DiCaprio and a whole bunch of other guys in that Gangs of New York movie, right, which was set ultimately in 1863. It concludes in 1863 with the New York City draft riots, which were a reaction not only by the Irish immigrants to being drafted into the Civil War, but also it was a reaction, secondarily, by Irish immigrants to new influxes of Irish immigrants and influxes of blacks from the South who were taking up all the jobs, okay, in New York. And so one of the management's tactics that I didn't mention before, but that is at least implied by that, is that you can get, when you have a lower demand for labor than you have a supply for labor, you can get the laborers and pit them against each other. Okay, you can have them vie for the limited availability of work. Okay. Now, Government and court action. The federal government initially sided with labor. Okay. The court cases that came up, we have Coppage versus Kansas in 1912. Again, we'll deal with this when we get to 1912. The court upheld the legality of the Yellow Dog contract. The ICC and the antitrust legislation, I mentioned this before. The ICC it comes from the International Commerce Commission, Interstate Commerce Commission, rather, the Interstate Commerce Commission, which flows from the Sherman Antitrust Act. And its original intention, as I mentioned just in the previous couple of slides, was to prevent the organization of labor unions because labor represents a horizontal monopolization of the labor force. Now, a final note here, just kind of on this urbanization. What is it? I think it's the web link number 38. That's on urbanization. You want to take. I decided that we have so much to work on with these PowerPoint slides that I kind of gave short shrift to urbanization. But you want to pay attention to the web link on urbanization because remember this: in terms of our weekly quizzes, all of the class materials are fair game. Okay, and so some of the questions in this week's quiz, in the second week quiz, can absolutely be drawn from that web link, even though I don't go over it very much. Growth of industry and the growth of cities, okay? And it's very simple to understand. We talked about this in the last slide presentation, the development of the Lowell Shop. The Lowell Shop is the first to gather together all of the various stages of production in one facility, which will be the forerunner of the factory. Okay. Well, if you're going to gather all of the various stages of production together in one location, you're going to have to gather together your labor force into one area. That's the beginning of urbanization. Urbanization refers to a high density of population. That's urbanization. Okay, is a high density of population. And so the cities, particularly New York, Chicago, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Rochester, New York will begin to grow. Buffalo, New York will begin to grow because of the development of industry there. In Pittsburgh, if we just take Pittsburgh, for example, the development of the steel industry in the latter 19th century in Pittsburgh is the reason Pittsburgh begins to grow. Okay, because people don't really, and this is kind of tangential, but people don't really flock to the city. People flock to the availability of jobs. If you locate your factories in a city, people will then flock to the cities to get the jobs. Okay? All right. And so you see the growth of the cities was a 400% increase in urban population. And just as kind of a side note, I did my undergraduate work, my college, at a little place called Hiram College, which is 35 miles southeast of Cleveland. And while I was there, I lived on a 111-acre organic farm. And so at that point in time, I became kind of a country bumpkin. When I did my graduate work, I started at Georgetown University, and I lived, this is one of those things that irritates the hell out of me. I lived in Washington, D.C. I talk to people all the time. I say, where do you live? They say, I live in Washington, D.C. Oh, yeah, whereabouts? Oh, well, I actually live in Silver Springs, Maryland, or Fairfax, Virginia. But then you lied to me. You don't actually live in Washington, D.C. I lived on Garfield Street Northwest, right off of Connecticut Avenue by DuPont Circle. Okay, I lived in Washington, D.C. And so it was just a real urban centers are too many people in too little space. That's what I think. People living on top of each other. I need my elbow room. I need my breathing space, right? And so that's kind of the final cut, just kind of as an aside on urbanization. All right, now that concludes 1.3. And it's, I think, as far right now anyways, it's the only PowerPoint lecture for the week. So the quiz will entirely be drawn from this and from the web links that we have.